Welcome to the Great Humbling Podcast. I'm Dougal Tyne, and since 2020 I've been recording these conversations with my friend Ed Gillespie. We start where our work meets and the places it takes us, the things that we're reading, the things that are getting us thinking, circling around the thought that these times in which we're living might be a humbling, a time of being brought down to earth and changed by the impact. Thank you for listening. Well, Ed, it is the 5th of November. Remember this great day of political history and intrigue. It is John Berger's birthday.
Is it?
He would be 98 years old if he was still with us. I remember the last interview with him pretty much before he died, because he died at New Year 2017. And I think the last interview with him, someone did an interview with him just after Donald Trump won the 2016 general election, which was every bit as thoughtful and outside of the simple kind of hive mind collective responses as you would expect. But here we find ourselves on John Berger's birthday, on the anniversary of the gunpowder plot, on election day. And I said to you, American election day, isn't that funny how those of us in other parts of the world can just find ourselves referring to it as if it's our event rather than theirs. And I said to you, let's try and get an episode done and I will turn it around really quickly so it's out before we have the results. And you were like, oh, I don't think you have to be that quick, Dougal.
Well, exactly. I mean, we might not have a result for some time. I was also reflecting on the fact that the gunpowder plot of 1605 was actually, I mean, the way that Robert Catesby tried to justify it was tyrannicide, like to remove a tyrant leader in the form of the king and regime change. So it's like, it's even closer to the bone than you might think.
So here we are, and I'm sure that this is what we're going to talk about a lot in this episode. But firstly, how are you, my friend?
I'm really good. I've just been down in London for a great hard art session yesterday. I've also had my first ever Molly dancing performance. I don't know if you're familiar with Molly dancing.
I am not.
You're not. So the one thing to say is it's definitively not Morris dancing. But I've joined a group which is called Old Glory. The posters of which say, out of work ploughboys dance to a slow, heavy step in a particular way and demand money with menaces. And I mean, the tradition was that, seasonal agricultural laborers would be skint in the winter, in midwinter in particular. Yeah. And so they would black out their faces and go and dance at the pubs to raise beer money and money for food. And they would black out their faces in order that the squire wouldn't recognize them and realize that they were moonlighting. So it's an extraordinary group. And I saw them perform a couple of years ago at the Locks Inn, at the pub of the Long Now. And it was like this mesmeric night on winter solstice where these kind of firelit torches came across the marshes out of the mist. And then, this dozen blokes all in old, like 19th century agricultural wear, and blacked out faces, and a band of musicians, all female, behind them. And they came and performed these dances outside the pub. And it was like, wow, I've just gone back in time 150 years. So.
Wow. Yeah, I can see why you signed up. And also I have to say that your collection of pewter tankards are sort of very on brand.
Exactly. Very on message. We performed, so that it was on Soane. So the first performance of the winter, and is in our sort of the spiritual home of the Old Molly group, Old Glory group, which is the Rumbra Buck. Which is a lovely village pub in Suffolk, and you've got all the photos on the wall of the Molly dancing group over the years. And yes, there were a lot of tankards and a big folk session. Although I did get into trouble because I sang it turns into a folk music session after the dancing. and it's like proper session. Anyone can stand up and sing a song. And so Graham, the guy who got me involved, said, have you got a song, Ed? I said, yeah, I've got a song. Couple of ales in. I was like, yeah. So I sang the dog song from the play 40 Years On by Alan Bennett, which I was in like in my early teens at school. And the song basically is about all the dogs getting together and hanging their assholes on hooks in a hall. And then one of the dogs gets up and shouts fire, and they all panic and they all grab an asshole off the nearest hook. And then they're all very uncomfortable because they're wearing someone else's asshole. And the kind of punchline of the song is, and that's why a dog will leave its bone to sniff another's asshole in the hope it is his own. I sang this, and it's sung to you'll recognize the tune because it's sung to the tune of the Church's One Foundation, which is sort of, legendary hymn. But yeah, someone complained.
Oh, well,
it's not very trad.
We haven't had any complaints about the excremental turn in season 6 of The Great Humbling, but it does appear that it's ongoing with your choice of song. Well, I was in London last week. I mean, barely have I had the chance to process the learnings of Visit America September 2024 when Alfie and Anna and I set off on the train. We went to Paris first. Alfie and I went up to the Eiffel Tower because he wanted to do it and I'd never done it. Anna sat at the bottom with our dear friend Hassan and drank champagne and pointed out that it was cheaper to drink champagne than to go up the Eiffel Tower. So the family, we had saved by her not happy. Everyone was a winner. And then we went over and we were staying, Alfie and me stayed with my parents in Wisbech for a few days. And my dad brilliantly arranged for us to go bouldering.
Wisbech?
In Wisbech. How
did you find boulders in West Norfolk?
We found North Cambridgeshire, so just get your geography right. But we found the Fenrock Bouldering Centre in the old auction house just on the edge of Wisbech town centre. And Alfie and I spent a wonderful 3 hours. First, we got our initiation, and then we just spent 3 hours scrambling up and down these walls. I was feeling it in my body for 3 days afterwards because, as we established in the last episode, I'm not a young man anymore. But it was brilliant. And then I went
younger than me.
Yeah, I'll always have that. And I went down to London and did a couple of things with some of our hard art friends, as you may have heard, and also at the Kairos Club. And actually, this was the most interesting. I went to the Unheard Club and had a really wonderful evening of conversation and questions. And it made me realize that there is merit in me going looking for spaces where I can talk about the stuff I write about and speak about, where I can't take it for granted that there's going to be the same set of assumptions, the same kind of consensus that I can almost take for granted in a lot of the rooms that I get invited to speak in. And especially because these days, if I come to a city like London and I'm speaking somewhere like Unheard, well, on the one hand, they'll have their members and regulars, but on the other hand, there's a bunch of people who've come because they have an association with my work. And so we genuinely end up with what I think that at its best Unheard is trying to do, which is bringing together unlikely combinations of people in a room and holding a space of conversation over difference. And that really, it felt like that happened last Thursday. So
great. And yeah. I mean, that actually chimes quite a lot with, so George Marshall was there with us at Hard Art yesterday. Who many will recognize from his work with the Climate Outreach and Information Network. And George has obviously been, banging the drum on building those bridges between the different polarities. I mean, his talk yesterday was called Melting the Poles. How do we bring people together? Right. He started out, he goes, I hate that wretched Margaret Mead quote, referring to never question whether it's a small group of people can change the world. It's anything that ever has. He goes, he goes, it's nonsense. He goes, actually, we need much bigger, broader coalitions and to have those wider conversations. And yeah, he gave a fascinating talk about working across the political spectrum, you know, and working with people as they are and where they are. And you know, we all say that we celebrate diversity and we all gain from diversity and everyone's got something to contribute. And then particularly, you know, environmentalists are very good at just then actively rejecting any kind of conservative.
Not that kind of diversity.
Yeah. Well, George made that point. He said, you know, political diversity is also a form of diversity. You know, we can talk about ethnic, class, socioeconomic, you know, all of the other diversities that we're very comfortable with. But then we get to political diversity and it's like, as you say, it's like, except you lot.
Yeah.
I don't agree with you.
Yeah. So it was fun because Rupert Reed and the Climate Majority, that great new beat group, came down. All Rupert Reed and the Climate Majority, all three of them came down to Unheard. But it was great. I was able to give a shout out to Rupert because he's somebody else who I think is, you know, full-heartedly trying to work and trying to figure out what depolarization around all of the stuff that we talk about looks like. So that feels like something we should come back to in this episode, given that we're recording on American Election Day.
Yeah.
But first, we have our traditional question. Ed, what have you been reading? What's been getting?
What have I been reading? I've read this wonderful book this last week, which is Elif Shafak, who I think I've talked about before, but this is her latest, There Are Rivers in the Sky. So she's a British-Turkish author. I think I talked about her previous book, The Island of Missing Trees, which is a really evocative novel about Cyprus and divided Cyprus, and one of the characters in the book was a fig tree. There Are Rivers in the Sky is just as beautiful, and it's essentially a book about the magic and wonder and connection of water, and water across time and water through space. So it's one of those lovely novels that weaves lots of different threads from, you know, a young man born in poverty in London who discovers he's able to translate cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia. You know, he gets his way into the British Museum and he can understand them, which is partly based on a true story. And then she weaves that thread with connections to Nineveh and the Yazidis. And it's, you know, as I say, it's across time as well. So some of the stories are, you know, hundreds of years ago, or even thousands of years ago, and others are quite contemporary. And it's just a really, really wonderful read, very cleverly put together with this wonderful flow, literally, of the water across space and through time, connecting disparate individuals and their different lives.
And so he discovers this kind of inexplicable capacity to read the cuneiform tablets. Am I understanding it right?
Well, I think, as I say, it's based on a true story. He was able to recognize patterns. I mean, I think, you know, we would describe the character now as, you know, having a degree of neurodivergence. But he was recognized in the British Museum as being able to understand something in these tablets that everyone else thought was gobbledygook.
So that connects to one of the things that I've been reading. I can't hold it up to you because I've been reading it as an audiobook, but people have been telling me about it. Like, I've just heard rumors about it from different directions for a while. And somehow this weekend, as I got back from the trip, I thought it's time to plunge into it. It's a book called American Cosmic: UFOs, Religion, Technology by Diana Walsh Pasulka, who is a heavyweight religious studies scholar. Yes. And I have a feeling it's going to be one of those books that it's a bit like the KLF book that you brought to the last series, where we actually need to chew on it and unpack it over a couple of episodes.
I will have to read it then.
Well, yeah. So I think this is me saying, Ed, you know, every now and then I drop a book on you where it's like, this is going to break you in a good way. And I think this is one of those books. But I mention it because one of the things that she is taking seriously and attending to within the stories and the experiences of the people she's researching in the book is the kind of the inexplicable capacities it's a book that is partly about consciousness and the nature of reality and the possibility that our default assumptions of that cut us off from whole layers of reality, ways of knowing. And so some of the people she's dealing with have very compelling um, experiences that make very little sense within what we're meant to take seriously if we want to be taken seriously as grown-ups around here lately, and yet are playing, whether it's within the state, military, or private sector, roles where the things that they're able to do as a consequence of these capacities that might otherwise be exiled capacities, the fruits of them are taken seriously because they work. And that's a theme that I think we could fruitfully explore further, because it would connect up with a few other things. Have you got any other books on your plate at the moment, Ed?
No, well, I've literally just started reading Derek Gow. I think I read Hunt for the Shadow Wolf, which I talked about probably last series. But his new one is called Birds, Beasts, and Bedlam, which is sort of Derek Gow in his Gerald Durrell mode, which is like, let me tell you all the mad stories of my animal relationships since I was a child. I mean, and he's famous for bringing back endangered species or previously extinct species, whether it's beavers or like auroch type cattle and bison. And so the book, I've only just begun it, but it's just full of wonderful little tales of his adventures with his connections with different rare and endangered species.
Well, that sounds great. I think I've got also a couple of books that I have just started on because they were waiting for me in the post when I came home from this trip, but that are worth mentioning briefly. Firstly, this one, Caring for Life, a post-development politics of infant hygiene, carrying on with the poo theme from the last episode. Kelly Dombrowski sent me this, and I've only kind of got through the first 20 pages or so, but it's fascinating because she's looking at a really concrete example of something that is at once universal and always culturally inflected, which is how we look after, very young children and their bodily needs in that, those early stages of life when they're not at the point where they can take care of their needs themselves. And she's looking at it particularly through this lens of post development. So, in other words, getting out of the assumption that the whole of human history is converging towards one way of being human together, which some of us around here lately have enjoyed and which everyone else is headed towards, and attending to the practices that don't fit with that story that might actually be saner in certain ways, but also the culturally held nature. So she's looking on the one hand at something I remember from being in China 20 years ago, which is that Chinese babies don't have nappies. They have slits in the bums of their
Yeah.
Parents will hold them out. You'll see them being held out over the gutter. And then this has been kind of taken up in communities in the West and translated and adapted. And so the other side of her research is with a network of mothers in Australia and New Zealand adapting and adopting these practices in a modern Western context. And it's just really interesting to me because one of the things that I was talking about at Kairos last week is how when we surrender, when we give up on this idea of making sustainable the incredibly resource intensive ways of life of the Western middle classes, and begin asking instead, what are the things that we need in order to stay alive? And what are the things that we need in order for life to be worth living? And try and navigate the field of presently unimaginable futures in relation to those two questions. One of the things I'm then looking for is people who are applying themselves practically to particular aspects of that. And this book is definitely, an example of that. So,
It just reminds me of in my consultant days having a furious argument with someone from Procter and Gamble
Oh,
about that precise Chinese example, because I was saying, if you are taking your disposable nappy product into a Chinese cultural context where there is no precedent, you know, that is the opposite of sustainability. However efficiently, you deliver that product, it's insane to go into a country of 1.4 billion people where there's no history of nappies, and a great cultural practice which means they're not necessary, and you're only doing that for the money,
and
and
part of what's interesting about the story that Kelly Dombrowski is telling is that, both the nappy products and disposable nappy products and the milk formula bottle feeding have been pushed into China by the Western companies primarily. Whilst bottle feeding has taken off, the nappies haven't. And that's part of what she's kind of inquiring into, sort of in the tradition of the great feminist economists, J.K. Gibson Graham, about the failure of the totalizing projects of corporate globalization, and the importance of attending to the examples where it actually doesn't work, despite all of the best efforts of Procter and Gamble and the rest of them. So I have one more little book to bring to your attention.
yes, I have that on my file as well.
It arrived as it was waiting for me when I came back from this trip. The Plant Pamphlets by Mark Watson, dear beloved, much missed Mark, whose death earlier this year came as a great shock to us all. And this, I'm sort of tearing up as I look at it, but this is such a beautiful, beautifully done tribute, drawing together Mark's unique ways of being and ways of teaching people to be with plants, with the stories of 12 of the plants that were, as Charlotte Ducan says in the introduction, canonical for Mark. They were the ones he kept coming back to, living with, introducing people to. And it's just full as well of beautiful, it's got photographs of Mark in action, and it's got new work by Anne-Marie Culhane, a wonderful artist and collaborator of Mark and Charlotte. It's got recipes, it's got everything. It's just exquisite. So that is available from the Dark Mountain website, and really, really recommended. It's a little book that's full of heart and soul and life.
You're taking me back to that beautiful, and very poignant moment where we stood in Charlotte and Mark's back garden when you were over here previously, and Charlotte was pointing out, because those were the plants that Mark had planted. I remember she sort of said, "These are Mark's friends. These are our friends," and it's like, yeah, much missed. My final memory of Mark was after our live show in Norwich. Do you remember we were having dinner here?
Yes.
And Mark and Charlotte went to leave, and Mark came up to me with half a bottle of wine, and just with a twinkle in his eye said, "Do you mind if I take this home so I can have a glass after the drive?" And I was like, no, be my guest. But it was such a wonderful sparkle of mischief in his eye.
That's Mark. That was Mark. Bless his memory. And yeah, here we are, November the 5th. Remember in many senses. Ed, I wanted to ask you if you have any memories from the last two American elections that you'd like to share, either from 8 years ago when Trump was elected, or from 4 years ago when it was Biden, and all of the aftermath of either of those. What comes to mind when I ask you about that?
2016 was very vivid, I think, only because I remember saying to someone in the morning, I was saying to my partner actually at the time, I just said, and she was half American, and I just went through into the bedroom and said, they elected the monster. And she just said, I knew they would. And yeah, I think I think it was that Brexit year as well, wasn't it? It was like 2016 felt like the end of a lot of things. And a time of humbling. in the way that we would describe it. So I think so many of the supposed certainties and confidences and beliefs that I held started to loosen and come apart that year. So I think it felt like a year of discombobulation about having to rethink and reset and reimagine the way that I was approaching a lot of my work and the world. I mean, 2020 was just a relief. I was just like, can this fever dream please stop? Because it like between 2016 and 2020, and that was also the furnace of my own sort of horrible personal experiences. My dad died in 2016, so my dad died not long before Brexit and Trump. So it was very poignant because I would often go back to that and go, my God, what would my dad be saying about that? What is happening? Because he famously used to say, the answer's not just no, it's fuck no. I think Dad's response to Brexit and Trump would have been along those lines. But yeah, and then I lost my business, daughter, and I lost my brother. I mean, it was that 2016 to 2020 was a horrendous period of my life with Trump and his daily tweeting and whatever madness. I look back at some of the talks I gave publicly. You look back at the slide decks where there was like nuclear saber rattling with North Korea, and then he was best friends with Kim Jong-un, and and it's just like it just felt insane. And so I think in 2020 it was just like whatever we get, however Biden turns out to be, it's got to be, particularly after the lunacy of the pandemic as well, and Trump getting people to drink bleach, and you look back and it's like it's hard to believe it was actually happening. And the prospect of it happening again feels like something that I don't fully understand. And that's the really hard bit, because clearly I haven't learned enough over the last 8 years to be inside the heads and hearts of people who think that return is the best thing. I don't know about you. I mean, what are your recollections of the last two?
Oh, well, I mean,
you were probably up all night knowing you.
Yeah, so I was. And do you know, one of the things that means, actually, both with the Brexit vote and with the Clinton-Trump election, is that the early exit polls were pointing the other way. And so there was this moment of thinking that it was the opposite result.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling a certain sorrow at the point where it looked like Clinton had won in 2016, not because I was in any way rooting for Trump, but because I knew in my bones that nothing would be learned from what had been revealed during that campaign by how successful Trump had been. I think what I was possibly naive about was I thought that maybe something might be learned when he won. And I wrote a thing, I was looking back at this morning. I wrote a piece called When the Maps Run Out, that was, it was written 3 days after Trump won the 2016 election, really into that sort of liminal moment of disorientation. Because there is something, and a few times this has happened to me, I've written into that moment where, a whole world of right-thinking people, which often means left liberal thinking people, were completely convinced that there was going to be one outcome. And the official commentaries and polls and so on supported that. And so then there's a kind of unpreparedness for the actual result. I mean, in 2015, when David Cameron won a majority in the UK general election, that was an example of that. And so a few times I've had this experience of sort of writing into that moment where everyone's kind of raw and ripped open and has one skin less because of their disorientation. And actually what I learned, particularly after the US election in 2016, is the diminished, it's not even diminishing returns, it's the you can write into that. And what happens is for a few days, people reach out from all over the place going, wow, this thing you wrote is the only thing that's making sense to me now.
Mm.
And then 2 weeks later, people stop returning your mails on the follow-ups of the conversations they started within those days, because it's like they've sort of, I don't want to say they've sobered up, because I don't think it was a drunkenness, an insobriety in that moment exactly, but everything has solidified for them again. Now, I remember this very particularly with what I wrote after the Trump 2016 victory was, within 2 weeks, the people who had been getting on Zoom calls with me, really wanting to talk about how what I'd written was helping them make sense of the events, were coming back to me, and now they had their talking points that they had heard from enough of the people who were authority figures in their world. And so it was all about Russian interference, and it was all about the unfairness of the electoral college system, which none of them had been talking about. To me, if you can't point to evidence that you were talking about the unfairness of the electoral college system before the 2016 presidential election, you have no grounds to be talking about it afterwards. It's just become an excuse for not thinking about what, not staying with the trouble of what that, what that kind of monstrosity, to use your language, means. And that's what I saw, and it was really disheartening. And I remember the beginning of 2020, a few weeks before COVID kind of arrived and wasn't just this rumor on the Chinese horizon, having a conversation with an American friend and voicing for the first time, I said, I think Trump might be going to get reelected. And I still think it's quite possible that if it hadn't been for the pandemic, that would have happened.
Yeah.
And I said to her, because I feel like nothing has been learned in the last 4 years by his opponents. And I think this is the bit that I want to underline. Ryan Meager, he writes a great Substack. RG Meager is his name on Substack. We'll stick the link in the show notes. He wrote a piece the other day about what would Hunter S. Thompson have made of this US general election. And he was like, what Thompson was good at his best was refusing the idealizations of either side.
Yeah.
And this is sort of Meager's rendering of it for today. Two things can be true. Trump can be a piece of trash, a piece of scum, a piece of garbage, and his opponents can be deeply defective and failing to show up to the moment that we're in. And what's hard is I understand the need to engage and to campaign, and to pump out. If you're invested, if you're engaged in a what feels to you like an existential campaign, to be promoting how wonderful your candidate is. But I think that part of, again, Ryan Meager said this in I think on Substack Notes the other day, the question that's not been asked over the last 8 years, the question that's been asked is why Trump? And then you get into all of these explanations of the pathologies and racism and all of the other factors that are analyzed as being why people are voting for Trump. But the question that you hardly ever hear asked is why not the Democrats? What has been the utter failure of the other party to convincingly win in 2020 rather than just scrape through, to beat this candidate who is, in many ways quite monstrous. Now, there are all sorts of things that can be said about the role of monsters in times like these. I suppose the other bit that I'd want to bring to the table is to say, I don't ever seem to hear anyone putting together the observations that I hear made separately by either side, which is that we've had 2 election cycles now, 2016 and 2020, when the losing side has not accepted the legitimacy of the winner. Now, the means and methods of acting on that refusal to accept the legitimacy have been different. During Trump's presidency, it was a whole Democratic establishment and New York Times and other, you know, powerful media outlets that were constantly promoting the Russia conspiracy theories, and which you can go into the evidence on this. They didn't manage to stand it up, but you don't hear many kind of acknowledgements of that. And so then, after the 2020 election, obviously we have January the 6th and that kind of monstrous pantomime, very ugly and with real violence involved in it. But it is one of the signs of a system that's in deep trouble when the elections no longer produce results that are accepted as legitimate by both sides. Now, we could go further back and we could say that actually there have been good reasons to question the legitimacy of results in US presidential elections further back in time. But I'm really struck by how the polarization and the partisanship is such that you only ever hear people talk about one side of that, and rare to hear them both acknowledged in the same breath. So those are just some of the things that. Okay, no, I've got one more thing for you, and then I'm gonna let you run, which is, I think this is worthless. I think Harris is probably going to win. That's my election day prediction. And
I'm gonna say I hope so too.
Well, I get that, but it was a take that I saw that I found quite convincing, which said, in 2016 you had a lot of shy Trump voters. It was a matter of shame to admit that you were going to vote for Trump. That's not how America looks today at all. It's the other way around. There are a lot of, people who in no way share the kind of joy and enthusiasm of the full on pro-Harris campaigners, but who were actually disgusted by January the 6th and who are not enthused by the kind of Elon Musk tech bro alt-right wave around the 2024 version of Trump. And I read that and I thought, because there is this thing that the polls, it's not just that the polls have been kind of unprecedentedly even. It's that the statisticians are looking at them going, they're suspiciously even. Like they're not even scattered as wide as they ought to be statistically. So there is a kind of bet hedging on the part of those doing the polling because they're finding it so hard to calibrate for some of the factors involved in this particular election that they're killing their outliers and clustering around this very, very narrow thing. And I think, I don't know. What's more worthless than a bearded English guy sat in Sweden talking to his mate on Zoom on the election day, pretending to be an electoral pundit? So you didn't even hear it here first.
Well, I'm not going to say you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, at least the small consolation is, if Trump gets in, you'd be very low down on the list of targets of people who questioned him, to be taken out, or the enemy within. You'd be like, there's this guy in Sweden, and we're going to get him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny when you talk about, the fuss that was made about the Russian interference in the aftermath of 2016. In a way, that then explains why Trump has doubled down so intensely on the stopping the steal, the kind of the questioning of electoral process and the the the, the acknowledgement that there's flaws, real or imagined, in the electoral system, and because that's what he does. That is the sort of really dark and twisted genius. Is like whatever he is accused of, he just echoes back and projects it immediately onto the opponent. And I hadn't actually thought about it. I mean, there's multiple examples of the way he does that now, but clearly, that the motivation to do that in 2020 must have come from that sort of burning resentment of the questioning of that 2016 result.
And the playing dirty that went.
Playing dirty, yeah. I mean,
Let's
exactly.
be honest about it. There's no clean hands on either side here, which is not
No.
to say that it's no different who wins, but that's why it flies when he talks about that, is because there are lots of people who are sympathetic to his side politically, who could see the effort that was made to try and delegitimize his election, and the willingness to play dirty there.
Yeah.
And I just think that's worth saying.
But also, as you say, it's like it's so split down the middle. I mean, as you say, you could barely get a kind of piece of paper between the polls because it's just so 50-50, which feels like an echo of where we've been for some time. And it's how you then begin to overcome some of that. I mean, George Marshall was talking about this yesterday when he was describing how, the issues that should be to the fore are not, things like climate, become politically contested because they are no longer issues about science and rationality, but they're issues of values and identity. So now people just reject things like the climate as a challenge because it doesn't sit with it doesn't call to the values and identities that they hold. And my fear, even in the kind of the aftermath of this, is that you still have, whoever wins and however long it takes to come to a resolution. And some people even argue that, what we're faced with potentially is a slow motion coup. So, assuming Harris comes out marginally on top, wins the Electoral College by a whisper, and has a reasonable win in the popular vote. But then there are enough states where there is questions, whether real or imagined, over the validity of the count. You've got a Supreme Court who is, in position to make judgments further down the line. But
maybe, to have a coup, you have to have an army. This is why I say that January the 6th was an ugly pantomime. Rather,
yeah. It's okay. So coup is perhaps the wrong word, but the point I want to make though is about how you then focus on the division.
Yes,
because you saw the politicization of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, coming in quick succession, one after the other. And what George said yesterday that really resonated with me about overcoming these divides is, what happens next as you get this intensification of further climate incidents, like we just saw in Valencia last week with the catastrophic floods in Spain. And he said there's a number of things that are going to happen. It's like when people experience anxiety and trauma, it intensifies their identities. Actually, it makes them more rigid and less flexible and less understanding. People inevitably look inwards. They become much more localized. They look to their community, the joy of belonging, the people like them. It's very much about that solidarity. There's a shift to a sort of defensive adaptation mode, but this is where the appeal of the far right and the right-wing policies that Trump has been mercilessly following through on, which is these anti-immigration narratives, can be really consolidated and enhanced. And also you get this kind of almost counterintuitive, like doubling down on high carbon behaviors. People, will almost be more wedded to their giant SUV, and more wedded to their high meat diet. I think the terminology that George used yesterday was like reactive meat porn on Instagram, where people are eating these burgers of like, they're a foot high. And it's
So,
like,
what's George's suggestion for how to begin to break the spell of this?
well, so I think there's a couple of things. It's not just George. So I mean, it's such a cliche, but we've got to listen. We've got to, and listen. Listening sounds so simplistic, and it's very difficult, I think, when the language is so inflammatory. The rhetoric is so laced with violence. People have a zero tolerance type of attitude. That's the demagogue at the top who's
Yeah.
responsible for that. But a lot of the people below that, I don't believe, are all kind of fueled by violence. I can't believe 50% of America, is 100% in line with that. There's a lot of nose holding and a much broader coalition that can be appealed to. I mean, George would say that you've got to find the narratives, particularly around climate, that can appeal to those conservative values and notions of identity. So some of it will be about localism and local environments. He gave an example of like, Nebraska farmers who were against the Keystone pipeline because they didn't want an oil pipeline going through, their green and pleasant land. There's stuff around energy security. There's elements around the good life, waste and common sense. But I think, this comes back to what the work of hard art is all trying to be about, which is like, how do you take this nexus of climate and democratic failure and bring the two components together in a way that is effective? And so the discussion we were having yesterday is like, we know, and Jamie Kelsey Fry would say this, in his best sort of Woody Guthrie guitar type way, but citizens' assemblies kill fascists. That is what they do. They are the Woody Guthrie guitar of radical inclusive democracy, because spending time allowing people to be heard, no matter how diverse and extreme their views may be, but having that representative sortition-based process, it is where you start to remove these extreme edges and find the kind of the fundamental common ground. And the point that was made yesterday very powerfully was that you've got to make sure that those citizens' assemblies are also framed around questions which aren't just seen as the sole responsibility of the left. So, you can't just have it on gay marriage. You've got to have it on immigration. And, I think we should have the confidence and the trust in the process to conduct citizens' assemblies on questions that we know are uncomfortable for left-wing perspectives, because that way you can have it owned by everyone and perhaps trust the outcome a lot more. And I think that's quite exciting to me, because we know we have the evidence that we can bring people together, whether it's like abortion in Ireland and issues like that. And yet we've got to have the political muscle behind it and the popular trust in it to be able to get to that, the far horizon.
I buy that. And I don't think citizens' assemblies are the beginning or the end of it, but I think they're part of a story of what rebuilding, regrowing a democratic culture looks like. And I think that going back to your thing of it being so split 50-50 when you look at the polls, it's really important, as you say, not to translate that into imagining that there's 50% of America that is really on board with everything that in the rooms that we spend time in we might imagine being a Trump supporter means, and another 50% that is really enthusiastically behind Kamala Harris, because that's not the story in any of our societies. One of the things I said when I was at Unheard last week was, when it comes to polarization in this kind of highly polarized environment, most of us are probably sensitized to the dark, troubling aspects of one of the poles.
Yeah.
And because that's where our attention is, probably a bit, willing to not look at the things that might also be troubling about the other pole. And part of the challenge and part of why we need to have strange combinations of people meeting each other and processes that allow for other voices and narratives to bubble up is how we respond to the things that are troubling about one pole within the existing array, without that meaning that we're just captured by the gravity well of the other pole. You know, I know people who will be voting for Trump today, and in some cases, because they genuinely in their hearts believe that it's a better chance of breaking the what's sometimes talked about as the machine, in terms of well, I don't even think we need to unpack that. That's a reference that we use from time to time. I honestly do not believe that anyone who has got the wholehearted endorsement of Elon Musk represents any real threat to the machine. I think what we have is two different versions of the machine that have different edges to them, different toxicities to them. And I'm not saying in that it's six of one, half a dozen of the other. I just say that those of us, you go on election day and you're faced with a binary choice and you choose with a how to minimize the damage mentality. Maybe there are some people who go in there with a more wholehearted enthusiasm for what they're voting for, but I think damage limitation is probably the sanest way to approach those kinds of binary choices. And as hard as it is for me to stomach, there might be some people whose damage limitation thinking genuinely lands them on the opposite side to where it would land me if I had a vote today. But beyond that, the real work is recognizing that there's a lot that is not represented or capable of being represented through this narrow mechanism of this binary choice. And that, a lot of political energy, a lot of democratic energy needs to go into other ways of meeting, other ways of experimenting with what democracy might mean now, that avoid the traps of being too powerful attractors. And if you're against one, you're for the other, because there's only limited circumstances in which that's the most helpful way to navigate. And I wanted to share something that came in a couple of posts from friends of this podcast in the last few days. And maybe this begins to move us to an end for this Remember episode. One is Vanessa Chamberlain on her Substack, The Tuning Fork, remembering a vision that she had, I guess, about a decade ago of a crack opening up in North American society and everyone kind of running to the left or to the right away from this crack, but of this longing which she describes in the piece to move towards the crack, to look down. It's the language of the Dark Mountain Manifesto, isn't it? It's time to look down. And that there might even be, in the darkness, in the things that are revealed in that crack, there might be cause for gladness as well. And that resonated really strongly for me with Adam Wilson's latest post at the Peasantry School. Adam always, tells this story of how one of the first times he found himself explaining the work they were doing with the Sand River Community Farm, he said, well, it's for what happens on the day when there's no food on the supermarket shelves. But his friend Sam from Bread Not Bombs, Food Not Bombs in Burlington said to him, well, you know what? For some people, there's already no food on the supermarket shelves because you haven't got money. There's no food for you. And so in the latest post, which is about taking the work that they've been doing with the feasts they've been holding once a month on the farm, and having reached this moment of doubt a couple of months ago, just before I visited the farm, of going, this feels like it's at risk of turning into a middle-class social club. So they reimagined it, and now they're out on the streets of the town itself, feeding anyone who wants to come without asking people to cross the threshold to the place that the food is coming from. And he's writing about building these new sets of relationships. But I was really struck by how that involved changing the tense from talking about a future thing that we're preparing for to talking about a thing that's already happened for some of those around us. And to me, that's what moving towards the cracks, being willing to go down into the cracks, that's what that looks like. And I don't know what's going to happen in this election, but either way, it doesn't change the need for that. And I think that's what we're both trying to lean into and speak to.
Exactly. I was reflecting on what I'd like to finish on today, and I ended up coming back to the William Stafford poem, A Ritual to Read to Each Other, and just saying, if you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. And, as well as looking into that crack and down, we need to look up, and let's hope that amongst the myriad of stars that we could or should be following, we find a way in all our different stripes to come together.
Thanks for listening to the Great Humbling podcast. You can find more at our website, homewardbound.org, where you can also subscribe to us on Substack. We're on Facebook as The Great Humbling. Ed is, I believe, still on the site formerly known as Twitter as @FruCall. And if you'd like to spend more time with my work, then visit aschoolcalledhome.org and find out about the online series that we're hosting there. The title music for the podcast comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks again for listening.